I'm in my 60s now, and I'd love to tell you I had some grand realization one morning. But honestly, it was smaller than that. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a box of pancake mix, reading the ingredient list without really meaning to, and I suddenly remembered my grandmother's hands making the exact same batter from scratch in about the same amount of time it would have taken me to read those instructions all the way through. So I put the box back on the shelf, and I decided to actually go back to the way she ran her kitchen. Not for a week, and not as some kind of experiment I'd abandon after a few days. For a full year. Here are the 15 habits I brought back, and what actually happened when I did. The first one was bread. I hadn't baked a loaf from scratch in years, and I'll admit, the first attempt came out closer to a brick than a loaf. But by the third week, something clicked, and I realized I was spending maybe 40 cents worth of flour, yeast, and salt on something I used to pay $5 or $6 for at the store, and it tasted better besides. Now the smell of it rising on the counter is just part of my Sunday. Then there was the question of scraps, which I used to throw away without a second thought, without even really seeing them as anything but trash on their way to the bin. Onion skins, carrot ends, the bones from a roasted chicken, the tough outer leaves of a head of celery, all of it used to go straight in the garbage. Now it all goes into a bag in my freezer, growing a little fuller every few days, and once that bag fills up completely, it becomes the base for a stock that costs me nothing but a little simmering time on a Sunday afternoon, and turns into soup for the better part of the following week. Meat got stretched too, the way I remember it being stretched at my grandmother's table, back when a pound of ground beef somehow fed a family of 6, without anyone at the table seeming to notice they were eating less of it than they assumed. A pound of ground beef, mixed with lentils or beans and a good amount of rice, fed my whole family for 2 nights instead of 1, and nobody at the table ever seemed to notice it wasn't a full pound of meat on their plate, or if they did notice, nobody said a word about it. It's a small trick, barely worth mentioning on its own. It adds up faster than you'd think over the course of an entire month, once you actually sit down and do the math on it. I started pickling, which I'd genuinely never done in my life. Cucumbers from a neighbor's garden, a simple vinegar brine boiled up on the stove, jars lined up on my counter looking a little like a science experiment the first time through, lids not quite sealing right, brine a shade too cloudy. 3 weeks later, once I'd worked out the ratios properly, they were better than anything I'd ever bought at a store, and they cost almost nothing beyond the vinegar and the jars I already had sitting in a cupboard from years of buying jam I never quite finished. My pantry changed shape entirely. Instead of buying small boxes of this and that every week, I started buying flour, sugar, oats, and rice in bulk, the way my grandmother always kept a full canister of each, lined up on her counter, labeled in her own handwriting on strips of masking tape. It meant a bigger bill on the days I actually restocked, sometimes $40 or $50 all at once, which felt strange to hand over at first. But it meant far fewer trips to the store overall, and I stopped that awful feeling of running out of something at exactly the wrong moment, halfway through a recipe, with nothing to do but drive out for a single ingredient. Leftover night became a real thing in my house again, something I hadn't thought about in years until I actually brought it back deliberately. Instead of throwing out whatever hadn't been finished from the week, one evening became dedicated entirely to turning it all into something new. A fried rice, a soup, a casserole built from whatever was actually still sitting in the fridge in half portions, nothing quite enough on its own to make a full meal, but somehow always adding up to one together. My grandmother called it using up, like it was just an ordinary chore, nothing worth remarking on, certainly nothing she'd have thought to put a fancier name on. I'd almost forgotten that used to be a completely normal Tuesday in nearly every house on the block. I put a small pot of herbs on my windowsill, basil, thyme, a little rosemary, mostly out of curiosity at first, half expecting to kill all 3 within a month, the way I had every houseplant I'd ever owned before this. It turned out to be one of the habits that paid off fastest and easiest of all. A single small pot of basil, kept alive with nothing but water and a sunny sill, meant I stopped buying a plastic clamshell of it from the store every single time a recipe called for 2 leaves I'd only ever end up using once, the rest going soft and black in the crisper drawer within a week regardless. I stopped buying most of my cleaning supplies too, Once I remembered what my grandmother actually kept under her sink. White vinegar and baking soda handled almost everything I needed in that kitchen. Counters, the inside of the microwave, even the drain when it started running slow and sluggish. It felt almost too simple the first time it worked exactly as well as the bottle I used to buy. And a little embarrassing, honestly, that I'd spent decades paying for a dozen different specialized sprays when two things from the baking aisle did the job just as well. Every jar that came into my kitchen started getting a second life, instead of going straight into the recycling bin the moment it was empty. A pickle jar became a container for bulk rice, a jam jar became a drinking glass, or a holder for the wooden spoons standing by the stove. It sounds like a small thing, and it is, but I noticed within a few months that I'd stopped buying storage containers almost entirely, my cupboards slowly filling instead with a mismatched collection of glass that somehow looked exactly right together. I started paying attention to what was actually in season before I decided what to cook, instead of the other way around. Tomatoes in summer, squash in fall, root vegetables through the winter, the same rhythm my grandmother's kitchen always followed without her ever calling it a rule out loud. Everything simply tasted better at its actual season, and everything cost noticeably less too, without the extra expense of shipping something in from halfway around the world in the wrong month, just so I could have strawberries in January that never tasted like much of anything anyway. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because somewhere around the fourth month, I started noticing something I hadn't expected at all. I'd assumed this whole year would be about saving money, and it was. But the bigger change turned out to be how much less I was actually throwing away, of anything. Food, packaging, containers, all of it. My grandmother's kitchen wasn't frugal because she was trying to be virtuous about it. It was frugal because waste, to her, simply looked like carelessness. And once I started seeing it the same way, most of these habits stopped feeling like sacrifices and started feeling like the obviously sensible way to run a kitchen. I brought my grandchildren into the kitchen with me, the same way I remember standing at my own grandmother's elbow as a girl, barely tall enough to see over the edge of the counter. They rolled dough, cracked eggs, stirred things they were probably a little too young to be fully trusted with, flour ending up on the floor more often than not. I found myself explaining, almost without meaning to, exactly why we did things a certain way. The same explanations I'd absorbed decades ago, without ever realizing I'd been paying attention. It's turned into the best hour of my week, most weeks, and it's the one habit on this list I never would have predicted when I started. Somewhere in the second month, I gave up searching for recipes online entirely and started a recipe box instead. Actual index cards, written out in my own hand, some of them copied straight from my grandmother's own box, stains and all, a coffee ring in one corner I've never once considered wiping off. There's something about writing a recipe down myself that makes me actually remember it, rather than needing to pull out my phone every single time I want to make the same dish I've already made 40 times before, scrolling past 3 advertisements just to find the measurements again. A Sunday roast, in my house now, is never just one meal. The roast itself is dinner on Sunday, the whole family gathered while it's still warm. Whatever's left becomes sandwiches on Monday, the meat sliced thin and cold. The bones, of course, go into that bag in the freezer, and by midweek they've become a soup that tastes like it took hours to make, because in a sense it did. Just spread out across 3 completely different meals instead of arriving all at once and disappearing just as fast. And the last habit, the one that ties all the others together, is that I started treating Sunday afternoon as a kind of preparation day, the way my grandmother always seemed to be quietly working ahead of the week rather than reacting to it as it arrived. A pot of beans started soaking on the counter before I'd even had my morning coffee. A batch of stock went into the freezer in small labeled containers, ready to be pulled out on a night I didn't have the energy to start from nothing. Vegetables got washed, chopped, and tucked away in the refrigerator for the days ahead, already halfway toward becoming dinner before Monday had even arrived. It meant that by Wednesday, when I was tired and didn't feel like cooking at all, dinner was already halfway finished before I'd even walked into the kitchen and turned on a single burner. None of this happened overnight, and I won't pretend every single week has gone perfectly. There have been Wednesdays where I gave in and ordered takeout anyway, tired in a way no amount of pre-chopped vegetables could fix, and I don't think my grandmother would have judged me too harshly for it. But a year in, my grocery bill is meaningfully lower than it was when I started. My kitchen smells like something is always about to be ready. And more than that, I feel like I'm cooking the way I was actually taught to, standing at an elbow much smaller than mine used to be, passing along the exact same thing that was once quietly passed along to me, without either of us ever calling it a lesson. If any part of this sounds like your own grandmother's kitchen, I'd genuinely love to hear about it down in the comments. And if it doesn't yet, it might be worth trying just one of these this week and seeing what happens when you do.